Hello everyone, my name's Karl Egerton from the University of Nottingham, and the title of my talk today is Cunning Plans and Representation in Fiction. So to introduce you to what I want to talk through today, it's well known that fictional depiction raises a whole range of different challenging questions about how we kind of fit this into our broader theory. And appeal to possible worlds has been raised by some as a promising way to resolve some of the difficult questions. But I think that reflecting on certain kinds of fictional property raises some serious trouble for appealing to possible worlds. And so in the paper, what I will do is I'll construct an example about strategy and strategists in an attempt to demonstrate how fictional facts about other possible worlds may cause us problems. So let's start out with thinking about fictional depiction and worlds. So there's a basic familiar question in the philosophy of fiction, which is what determines truth in a fiction? This seems to be something that we want to talk about unless we're going to give a very kind of strange, outlandish theory of fiction. Because we want to say that certain claims are true in a fiction and other claims are false in that fiction. So the sentence, Ahab goes whaling, is true in Moby Dick. We might not ever get this reported directly to us, because that would be a rather simplistic sentence to be included in the novel, but certainly it looks like it's entailed by many of the other things that are described. It seems to be an important part of what is directly described to us by the text. We also want to say that sentences like Ahab gives up whaling are false in Moby Dick, right? Because this is inconsistent with many of the things that we are told in the course of the novel. Okay, it's inconsistent with the narrative that we have been given directly. Now, these statements are perhaps less of a complex issue for us to deal with. We don't need anything beyond the text to establish them. We simply need to look at the sentences that are directly included and interpret what they are supposed to mean. But the explicit text does not exhaust the fictional truths. So we get the question, how are these other truths that go beyond those explicitly stated generated? Now, an answer to this kind of question is going to have to contend with a whole range of more complex cases. We have, for example, implicit truths, like the statement, Ahab is human. This seems to be true in the context of the fiction, but we are not told it directly, and arguably it's not entailed by the things that are described to us in the fiction. And there seem to be a number of other cases that are maybe more implicit. We also have incompleteness. There are certain things that fictions don't seem to pronounce on. For example, the statement Ahab can roll his tongue, and equally the statement Ahab cannot roll his tongue. These are not decided by the fiction. They are left undetermined, it seems. We also have problems with things like an unreliable narrator. So not only are there things that go beyond the text that's explicitly reported to us, we might also worry about how to make sense of things explicitly reported in the text that are in fact not true according to the fiction, where we have a narrator whose testimony we cannot trust. Finally, we might have cases of inconsistencies in fiction. Quite often these are due to mistakes. There are other more complex examples to deal with, but I'll just kind of report their presence for now. We're not going to go into them in detail. Now, quite often in the history of talking about fiction, fictional characters have dominated, perhaps because they have a certain kind of ontological interest. We want to know what the status of fictional characters is. Do we need to say they exist or do we not? But despite that interesting debate, the question of truth in general in fiction waits in the wings. There are still issues to be dealt with that go beyond the question of fictional characters. Now, it's intuitive to speak of fictional worlds when we evaluate the wider range of truths in a fiction. Okay, we might talk about the world of Harry Potter. And in general, we might think, when we go beyond the story itself, the story that we are being told, there are a whole bunch of background truths, and those seems to be the truth of the world of the fiction. And this becomes more natural still, given that there's a lot of prevalence of talk of things like world building as part of the creative process, especially for example, speculative fiction. And it's a strength of certain authors to build a world effectively. So this seems to be an important part of the kind of conceptual machinery of fiction. Now, but one way to take this kind of talk especially seriously and to attempt to marshal it to resolve problems of truth in fiction is to say that fictional worlds are possible worlds. Okay, this is an approach famously considered by David Lewis. There's a more recent discussion of it by Bourne and Caddick-Bourne. I'm not going to go into detail in how this is supposed to deal with those questions about truth in fiction. I also won't go into detail in the more subtle question of whether we should talk about fictional worlds as possible worlds or as sets of possible worlds that are consistent with a story. I don't think that makes a significant difference to what I'm going to talk about today. Rather, the general strategy is what's interesting us at the moment. So the problem that I'm going to explore is a direct challenge to possible worlds accounts. I'll also briefly mention impossible worlds accounts, although I won't be able to go into detail on them. But it's worth remembering that this may well extend to the wide range of theories of fiction that are, to quote Stacey Friend, silent as to whether the content to be imagined should be specified by possible worlds or in some other way. If we haven't ruled out this way of thinking about things, many theories of fiction may be embroiled in the same problem. But what is our problem going to be? Let's move on to our next section to find out. So to get us started on our problem, we're going to imagine a fictional scene. Okay, we're going to imagine a protagonist in a film or a book, whatever we might want. We're going to call them Strat. And we're going to suppose they've been portrayed as a master strategist. We can leave it open how, perhaps by an omniscient narrator, perhaps by simply the evidence of the actions they've performed in the narrative so far. And we're coming up to the climactic battle. Okay, it's that kind of story. And this climactic battle is crucial to overall victory or defeat. This battle unfolds in whatever way we like, and the ultimate outcome is that Strat's side wins. Now, of course, this will probably be unsure, uncertain, it may well be suspenseful, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, but we can say, in this case, we can imagine that once the dust has settled, the audience comes to recognize the following as a fictional truth. The climactic battle was won because of Strat's planning prowess. Okay, it seems plausible to me that this is something we want to say about certain kinds of fictional scenes that are depicted to us. Now, our initial question is this. Well, what would it mean for Strat to be a master strategist in a real world context? Because if we want to make sense of what that means in the fiction, we want to be able to say what it means outside fictional contexts. So we'll attempt to briefly do that now. Now, the following is a very rough, very speculative sketch of how we might think about this status of being a master strategist. I'd be very interested to hear any thoughts from people on how this might be refined and made clearer, but hopefully the broad picture doesn't get anything about how we think about this completely kind of off the mark. Now, I'm going to talk about strategies and plans as interchangeable. I'm not going to make a distinction between them. So we're going to say that for someone to be a good planner is for them to be disposed to make good plans. Okay, there's probably more to it than that, but that seems to be part of what we want to say. So we want to know what a good plan is. And we can propose at least two ways, I think, that we can call a plan good. So we might say that a plan is accurate. And for a plan to be accurate is for the information on which it relies to be true. So one way to plan well is to amass a lot of accurate information about the world, and thereby to have good information on which to base the actions that you are performing. So we find out a bunch of information and we use it to determine what our actions should be in order to achieve our goals. Another way that a plan could be good, though, is for it to be what we might call robust. I'm going to say that a plan is robust insofar as it succeeds at possible worlds close to the worlds at which it succeeds as intended. The idea of this is that we don't necessarily have the means to find out a whole bunch of information in which, through which to make a plan. So we can't always make these kinds of accurate plans. Rather, we might have a dynamic situation or one with a great deal of uncertainty. And in that case, what matters is that we have a plan that tracks the way things develop. And that is what I'm trying to capture with the notion of a robust plan. So very little's been said here, but this is the general picture that I want to give. A few notes before we carry on, just to clarify things. First of all, I want to say, well, we're here being neutral regarding the success of a plan, since good plans can fail. Most notably, if the reasons for failure are outside the knowledge of the person planning. But this doesn't really matter to us. In any case, we're talking about a particular strategist whose plan doesn't fail anyway. The second note, this regards a more subtle matter. I think that there are many more ways we might divide up good plans. In particular, I think we might divide robust plans up in interesting ways. For example, into two subcategories that we might call flexible and sturdy. Right? A plan can be robust by being flexible, that is by having many conditionalized actions, and so looking very different depending on how things unfold. On the other hand, it might be robust by being sturdy, where the idea here being that it wouldn't have very many conditional actions at all, but rather would have a fixed structure that was able to succeed in a wide range of circumstances. We might think of this as analogous to a dominant strategy in a game. Okay, one that doesn't require you to respond because it just overcomes the opposition in all or most cases. But in any case, the distinction is not crucial to our discussion. It's just something that's useful to have in the back of our heads as we think about how we think about planning. Now, the key takeaway from this comes from the notion of a robust plan in general. And it comes from the idea that robust plans seem to depend on how things are at close possible worlds. Okay, so that's what I'd like to take forward from here. Now, I'm going to assume from now on that Strat is a master strategist in virtue of their disposition to make robust plans. Now, this requires something. If this is a fictional truth, that they're a master strategist in virtue of this feature, it requires the truth of Strat's fiction, it seems, to include truths that go beyond the fictional world itself. And that shouldn't be particularly surprising, though, because we have various cases where that seems to be the case. So consider, for example, in the series Killing Eve, the character Villanelle could not be a desk. That seems a plausible thing we would like to say. Why? Because she's a human, and humans can't be desks. Or similarly, we might want to say that Villanelle could have dispatched a certain particular victim in the series with poison instead of with a scalpel blade. That also seems like something that we are fairly comfortable asserting. And a natural way to pass these claims is in terms of possible worlds. So according to the fiction, there is not a possible world at which Villanelle is a desk. According to the fiction, there is a possible world where Villanelle dispatches that individual with poison. But now we can note a somewhat overlooked point. We seem also to require fictional truths about the relative distance of possible worlds as part of how we evaluate fictions. And there are other cases, not just this planning example, that fit the profile. Suppose in the fiction that Villanelle decides at the last moment to spare A's life. Then we want to say that the following is true in the fiction. A had a lucky escape. That seems, again, an acceptable thing we want to say about the fiction. But a natural way to pass this is as saying that at a close possible world, A becomes a victim. Okay, so on to our last significant section. Now, so far, the intention has not been for us just to stroll through the terrain and observe various things about how fictions work. Rather, there's a kind of trap being set up. Why? Well, so far we've got our fictional master strategist, Strat. We've got a notion of what it is to plan in a robust way. And we've got an acknowledgement that there are truths about close fictional worlds in fictions. Now, our final component to generate our problem is a fleshed out view of what we're going to say that Strat did in this particular fiction. And here it is. So let us suppose that Strat's master plan, in this case, is to hold off the foe, who we're going to say is nigh unbeatable in a straight fight, over a long, drawn-out fight scene until another member of the team can launch a surprise attack, which will bring instant victory. I won't give more detail to this, except for a few different points, but hopefully you can get an image of the kind of scene we're envisaging. It should be fairly familiar. Now, given the circumstances, this scene, this fight scene, this plan requires a whole bunch of hair's breadth dodges where Strat's head is almost taken off by the enemy, scene changes where they crash through walls into another location, and a tussle that takes Strat over a cliff edge where they will hold on until, while the enemy showboats and explains their master plan, Strat's accomplice comes and pulls off the surprise attack at long last, probably with some perfectly timed quip, because again, that's the sort of fiction we're talking about here. So why is this a problem? Well, I want to say that given this fleshed out view of what Strat did, our common sense in evaluating what would be the case in the fiction tells us that Strat's plan would fail at very close possible worlds. Okay, very, very small differences, very, very similar circumstances would lead to that plan failing and Strat falling off the cliff, or having their head taken clean off, or the accomplice arriving when it's too late to do anything about Strat's death, and maybe about the broader situation. So given the fact that it's something that we would evaluate using our common sense about the circumstances going on, then we're likely to want to say that this is a truth in the fiction, in much the way that when we go back, we want to say that a certain victim might have had a lucky escape in the narrative of Killing Eve. But if that's a truth in the fiction, then, given the nature of robust planning as we've described it, given the close possible worlds that we are making judgments on, how can we say that Strat is a master strategist? It looks like we cannot say that, but it's something we've been directly told by the fiction. Well, there is a way that we can make this judgment. The only way that seems possible, given how we're talking about things, is for the fact about the closeness of possible worlds to differ in this fiction. But this is problematic if we think of fictional worlds as being presented as possible worlds. Why? Because our judgment about the relative closeness of possible worlds should not be changeable. Whether a possible world is close or not should depend on features of similarity between worlds. So there is a close possible world at which I have a different breakfast. What determines that? Well, the world is extremely similar to this world. I can't make reasonable judgments about possibility and probability if, as it turns out, some possible worlds are extremely close despite being radically different from how things are. This helps us to make reasonable judgments about possibility being objective. So the fact about the closeness of possible worlds should not be able to differ, because the similarity metric that we're using determines our understanding of possible worlds as possible worlds. Now, before closing, let's just think about a couple of possible escapes we might suggest from this. So first of all, maybe we might say that Strat simply cannot be a master strategist. This cannot be a truth reported by the fiction. Okay, the fiction must fail to report it. Well, I think that we lose a great deal by saying this. Strat's fiction does not seem unintelligible. So we don't want to say that it's simply making a nonsense claim or one we can't make sense of. That would suggest that we can't make sense of basically any Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson film. It would suggest we can't make sense of a whole range of different kinds of action adventure type films, as well as probably many outside that particular area. One potential way we might suggest would be to kind of offer impossible worlds as a way of dealing with it. So possibilities can change in fiction, and various people have suggested that we might use impossible worlds to deal with the fact that fictions appear to report impossibilities. But I don't have time to go into that in detail, but I don't think that's going to help us, since impossible worlds also need a similarity metric. So if the facts about relative closeness of possible worlds change, then this is going to be a difficulty for impossible worlds as it is for possible worlds as well. So I don't think that's going to work for us. Or perhaps we just say, okay, simple, the fiction just ignores certain possible worlds. Well, this is also, I think, problematic, although it's more promising for us, because the question arises, which possible worlds? We, of course, can restrict our talk of possibility in various cases, where I might say, it's not possible to cope with this workload. I will be ruling out a whole range of different outlandish circumstances, such as where I'm given direct doses of endorphins to try to alleviate any stress that I might feel. The thing that makes this response difficult is that a simple domain restriction is helpful if we have a clear criterion or if we're excluding outlandish circumstances. But in this case, what we're doing is ruling out certain very, very similar circumstances. So it's hard to know how we're supposed to articulate the idea that we give a domain restriction and ignore certain possible worlds. Finally, what if we say something like, well, this just shows that the fiction is a bad story. Okay, it's just a rubbish example of a fiction, and it doesn't succeed in any significant way. Well, I'm not sure that this would solve the problem anyway, since even a bad story is a story. We still have to explain how this is depicted in the first place. The only way it might work is if we say that the kind of failure is so bad that it constitutes something that would generate something like imaginative resistance, something where we cannot envisage what's going on. But given what I started by saying here, the fiction doesn't seem unintelligible. It seems coherent and something we can perfectly well understand. But even if this were to solve the problem, I don't think it's particularly plausible, because again, it would seem to rule out a whole range of different fictions. It would suggest that a whole range of different fictions are failures when they aren't obviously failures. Genre fiction, as a rule, it looks, would be quite seriously undermined. So I don't think any of these responses help us to resolve the problem. And so we're left wondering how we make sense of it if we have a possible worlds kind of account of fiction. Now, I'm just going to wrap up now. So what I've argued is that successful strategizing can be understood with reference to possible worlds. Okay, that was the broad sketch that I gave. Fictions seem to represent characters strategizing well. This seems uncontroversial. This is something that a fiction can represent to us. We've also said that this seems to require that the facts about relative closeness of worlds change in fictions. And in turn, this, if it is the case, presents a barrier to the claim that fictional worlds are possible worlds. So while we haven't offered a solution, one final remark that I would offer is that the problem reveals the need to think more closely about how features like genre conventions may play a key role in audience expectations. Okay, this seems quite clear that it does influence how we think about fiction. But we might think that these audience expectations in turn may well seem to influence what we should say about the possible and the probable within any particular fiction. Genre conventions may play a quite key role in determining what we say about that. Whether that can be reconciled with a possible worlds account of fiction, I think, remains to be seen. So just to finish, these are my references for the talk, and all that remains is to say thank you for listening and thank you to the organisers.